This video is part of the Controlled Opposition and the Ukraine Conflict series. If you want to know more or click other videos, please go to the description of this video.
In the first video of this series, I talked about how Russia was not conservative and not a traditional or based paradise for right-wingers. However, I think the question often comes to this. It's true that Russia's bad, but what does it have to do with us? What does Russia's invasion of Ukraine have to do with the survival of Western civilization? Or the survival of our nations? Like, why should we care when our borders are being invaded or migrants coming across the channel? Or that our infrastructure is failing at home, from roads to bridges or buildings collapsing? I suggest reading Alexander Dugin and his works, and how the Russian state is using him and his movement to infiltrate a lot of the right and influence the right's pivot towards Russia. Russia's strategy to infiltrate the right would seem perplexing, especially given their Soviet past and their relationships with the political left, whether real or alleged, in a lot of Western nations, via fifth columns. But if you understand the Soviet Union's founder, Vladimir Lenin, and his tactics, you won't be.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
In recognizing a communist, physical appearance counts for nothing. If he openly declares himself to be a communist, we take his word for it.
I fundamentally believe Russia is still a communist nation, or at least influenced by it, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Even if you don't believe in the Golitsyn hypothesis, which I do, you can look at my last video explaining how Russia is still very supportive of a lot of the historic Soviet ties, and still memorizes people like Lenin, or Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the Cheka, and the overall Soviet surveillance state. And because of those facts, I will not be hesitant to cite Lenin or other communists throughout this video and series. In one of Lenin's works, published in an illegal Bolshevik newspaper called Rappachi, or The Worker in English, Lenin laid out his views on compromising with his political opponents. In it, he cited Engels ridiculing some of the communists for not being flexible enough and for accepting no compromises, even when compromises may become a necessity, whether forced or voluntary ones, due to public opinion or circumstances. So long as Lenin stated that one doesn't compromise too much as to withdraw their principles from the equation, or that it doesn't hinder the final revolutionary development and aim towards world revolution and overthrowing the bourgeoisie. Of course, Lenin advocated the use of free speech and a free society to push their values, ironically using those freedoms given to undermine all of those freedoms. And in the dual power essay, Lenin recommended his Bolsheviks to use parliamentary democracy, that being the Petrograd Soviet, to gain power via convincing the masses. But the most important document is his book Left-Wing Communism, an Infantile Disorder, especially the specifics in chapter 6, where he mocked the leftists in Germany for not working with reactionary trade unions, or at least what they consider as reactionary, and that they should work to obtain support from a system left to them by capitalism on their transition to socialism, and work with the reactionary trade union as it is, while educating them on the merits of socialism and communism, and getting them to disregard the old reactionary principles, however slowly, but still, as long as they move towards the goal, then it is satisfactory. And this is why Russia is now infiltrating the right, and not just the left, as it did during the original Cold War. And you shouldn't be surprised of stories of Putin visiting some princes, or establishing some controlled opposition that is more conservative to the Soviet Union within Russia, in order to gain traction and the support among right-wingers in the West. This is also where Alexander Dugin comes into play, and his Eurasianist National Bolshevik ideology, as espoused in his works such as The Fourth Political Theory or The Foundations of Geopolitics. In The Fourth Political Theory, Dugin wanted to create an alternative ideology to liberal democracy, communism, and fascism, and seeks to unite the characteristics of the three ideologies and to create a new ideology in order to defeat liberalism. If this theory sounds very similar to what a lot of the European and American alternative right or dissident right have been saying, then it should be noted that Dugin has spent a lot of time having relationships with the European and American dissident right, and that Dugin himself boasted about creating the new right out of his own pocket. Moreover, Dugin stated that liberalism has defeated all its competitors in the ideological battle, and that his aforementioned ideology would seek to replace it. The reason for his dislike of liberalism is his view that liberalism leads to decadence, especially via its overemphasis on individualism, liberal freedoms, and what Dugin perceives as its involvement in globalism, especially with the disappearances of national identity, sovereignty, and borders to the globalists, especially the United States, which he considers the epitome of it. And as part of his new ideology, which he elaborated in his Foundations of Geopolitics book, he also stated a need to create a Eurasian Union or alliance to counter the United States and its influences around the world. In order to counter it, Russia must have the desire to spread isolationist sentiments among both the left and the right, and push racial tensions, especially among Black Lives Matter protesters or black radicals among the left.
I think of a lot of things. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sort of ideological theories.
or white supremacists among the right, and to create much division and tension so that the United States cannot unite, and therefore she would consume itself in domestic squabbles and potentially even a civil war.
Oh, but Dugin doesn't have an influence on Putin. I mean, his party was banned, and Dugin himself has criticized Putin.
Some would say. However, Dugin left that party and pledged support to the Russian government in the 2000s, whereas Limonov was more against the Putin government. Dugin's book is also required reading in the Academy of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, and was endorsed by General Rodionov, who was the Minister of Defense at the time. To summarize all of the aforementioned, if you believe in your nation state being controlled by yourself, instead of foreign Marxists aiming to subvert and destroy it, this is why you should see Russia as a threat. Do not get me wrong. This isn't an endorsement of the American world order or liberalism, by the way. However, if you also are skeptical of the US or NATO or whatever, you should also just be skeptical, if not more so, of Russia. Especially if you're on the right, as Russia still hasn't got rid of its communist ties, and is more akin to a nation trying to get revenge for its defeat in the Cold War. And now here's the main reason why I made this series. I'm observing a lot on the right, thinking that they're opposing the establishment, but in reality are doing the bidding of not just Putin, but also the political establishment that they rightfully deride. Now, let me explain and elaborate in the following segment about how the Western elites kowtowed to Putin, or Russia more generally, after the supposed collapse of the Soviet Union, and that a lot of the right-wing populists are going to betray the West the same way as the elites that you deride had done so.
We have agreed to eliminate the world's most dangerous weapons, heavy ICBMs, and all other multiple warhead ICBMs, and dramatically reduce our total strategic nuclear weapons. Certainly, I agree with what President Yeltsin said, that there is no animosity. The Cold War days are over, and he came here in a spirit of forward movement on these arms control agreements, and that speaks for itself.
The Cold War is over. Optimism now reigns across the world. The 80s has ended, and the 90s are beginning to shine. Nightclubs are full. Parties are on full swing. It's now the end of history. The end of conflict. The end of war. A new era of optimism, and capitalism and free markets and free trade are upon us. It's time to party. God bless the West. God bless the free world.
In the aftermath of the Cold War, the West decided to bring Russia and a lot of the ex-Soviet states into the world economic system. I personally believe this was a very big mistake. I mean, for example, imagine if the Allies defeated Nazism after 1945 but did not put any of the major leaders on trial, and the Gestapo and the Nazi Party were not banned by outside pressure. However, that's what occurred in Russia after the collapse of communism, or the supposed collapse of it. Even if you don't believe in the Galilean hypothesis that the Soviet Union faked its collapse in order to consolidate themselves and then revenge against the West when the time is ripe, it's been crystal clear that it has been, and that a lot of Russians still have the communist mindset. Organizations such as the KGB were simply renamed to the FSB. Moreover, people that used to be in the KGB are now in Russia's top office. For example, Vladimir Putin, who's now the president of Russia. Communist parties also still exist and run openly in elections, with a major one receiving second place in the vote and the amount of seats in the Duma. History repeats itself, or at least it tends to rhyme. However, a lot of people do not learn from history, and therefore we're doomed to repeat it. In short, rather than a new Christendom, Russia during the 90s, and even to some extent before the 2020s, is a modern-day version of the Weimar Republic. While the Allies won the First World War, and imposed the Treaty of Versailles. None of the German generals or anyone promoting German militarism and expansionism were on trial. The Kaiser was allowed to flee to the Netherlands.
The Kaiser flees to Holland upon von Hindenburg's advice. It's the will.
And one of the main commanders in the war, Paul von Hindenburg, was one of the Weimar Republic's presidents. The Western elites, especially the United States, has betrayed a lot of Eastern European nations, and especially Ukraine, via the Budapest Memorandum, where it forced Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons, which even Mearsheimer said it was a mistake. And even before Ukraine gained its independence, people like George H.W. Bush were discouraging Ukrainian independence, calling it blind nationalism. And for all the talks about NATO expansion,
Ooh, that monstrous NATO, annexing Eastern European nations.
it was actually only after the pressure of a lot of ex-Soviet or ex-USSR bloc nations that forced NATO its hand, rather than the globalist American empire gobbling up smaller Eastern European states that lie near Russia and trying to provoke Russia into retaliating or something. And actually, a lot of those states were actually right to fear Russia, as one should simply observe the Russian Empire after the First World War and the aftermath of the Soviet Union to see why a lot of Eastern European nations' fears about Russia were justified. After the German defeat in the First World War, Germany had to renounce all its claims in Russia made by the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and which also granted independence to nations like Ukraine and Georgia. And the Bolsheviks seized on that opportunity by invading Ukraine, Georgia, and its attempt to invade Poland, which failed. And in the 90s, when the Soviet Union collapsed and countries like Moldova became independent, Russia began stirring up trouble with its Russian minority in Transnistria. The Chechen Wars also played a role, where Moscow initially seemed that it wanted to recognize Chechnya's independence. However, a few years later, after the 1999 apartment bombings, it reinvaded and restored control to its territory and reincorporated it back into Russia. And the Western elites were not even united on the idea of admitting neo-Eastern European nations. George Cannon, who was the author of the Long Telegram that served the basis for the US policy of containment during the Cold War, wrote in the New York Times that such a decision may be expected to inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion, to have an adverse effect on the development of Russian democracy, to restore the atmosphere of the Cold War, to East-West relations, and to impel Russian foreign policy in directions not directly to America's liking. And of course, it will obstruct the START II agreement and the reductions of nuclear weapons between the both sides. Moreover, 50 famous signatories, which included Susan Eisenhower, who was General Dwight D. Eisenhower's daughter, and also Robert McNamara, who was the former American Secretary of Defense during the JFK and LBJ administrations, and who also formed the policy of escalation during the Vietnam War, wrote a letter to Bill Clinton back in 1997 urging him against the inclusion of new members due to the perceived provocation it would be to Russia, and that Russia was no longer a threat to the United States.
The highlighted line is hilarious with hindsight.
And while Clinton allowed NATO expansion, Bill Clinton failed to push back on Boris Yeltsin's comments on him desiring the whole of Europe to be given to Russia, or at least Europe being in Russia's sphere of influence back in 1999 in Istanbul, Turkey. And in continental Europe, a series of oil and gas pipelines were already being constructed, if not already in working order, even before the collapse of the Soviet Union, thus showing the European elite's betrayal of Western Europe to the Soviet hordes. However, this policy of appeasement did not end with the fall of the Soviet Union, because more pipelines were being constructed, the most notorious being Nord Stream 2. That project had the involvement of then-Chancellor Angela Merkel, with another former German Chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, becoming chairman of the Russian state-owned Nord Stream pipeline company. Corruption also entered our capital cities, with our leaders either unaware, complacent, or even welcoming those connections. The good old Western elite also failed to respond to the invasion of Georgia and was weak to the first Russian invasion of Ukraine by the fact that those projects still continued all the way up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine proper on the 24th of February 2022. Even Trump warned about the over-reliance on Russian gas by Germany. And on the American side, Bush and Obama were very friendly towards Putin. Bush ignored Russia's invasion of Georgia and had a lot of collaboration with Putin when it comes to the subject of terrorism, even though it was alleged by former Lieutenant Colonel of the FSB, Alexander Litvinenko, that Al-Qaeda's Ayman al-Zawahiri was trained by the Russian Secret Service. And Obama only placed meager sanctions on Russia following its annexation of Crimea. The latter even staged a reset with Putin and abandoned a Bush administration's initiative to put missiles in Poland and the Czech Republic. Instead, he preferred making a New START treaty in order to decrease nuclear tensions and decrease the threat of nuclear war. Ironically, it was Trump that actually refused to renew it, and it was actually Biden who extended the START treaty, at least before Putin decided to launch his invasion of Ukraine proper. I also find it very interesting that a lot of the dissident right and the progressive left criticize Obama and Biden for being overly harsh on national security, when in reality, it was Obama who pardoned Chelsea Manning, the transgender officer who leaked a massive trove of military secrets to WikiLeaks, and Biden was the one that released Julian Assange. Both of those incidences support my theory that the establishment and the dissident right are no different to one another on Russia. The Western elite's response to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine was often described by many in alternative media as being provocative, expanding NATO, disregarding Russia's spheres of influence, or being only concerned about Ukraine rather than the failing schools or failing infrastructure, or crime in cities, and not having any peace talks with Russia. To be honest, I don't know why people say their actions have been provocative, unless you mean provocative by the fact that they're not doing enough to assist Ukraine in its fight against Russia and the safeguard of our national sovereignties against the Eastern hordes. I mean, it's not even true that the West has cut off its ties with Russia. For example, Russia is still part of the Partnership for Peace, a NATO initiative. Though, to be fair, Putin doesn't really care about NATO expansion, as shown by his lax attitude towards Finland and Sweden joining, which he stated that it poses no direct threat. And in the early 2000s, he actually seemed very welcome for Russia to be a NATO member. The Western elite has also been very divided on the level of toughness it needed to show Russia. While countries like the UK and Poland and the Baltics are committed towards Ukrainian victory, nations like France, Germany, and the United States have been less decisive. Before the invasion, the US was already reluctant to send weapons, and a month prior to the invasion, Biden implied that he did not mind a minor incursion in Ukraine by the Russians. Additionally, many like France did not believe that there was an imminent invasion, and nations like Germany were still hooked on Russian oil and gas. Back in May 2021, Biden actually waived the Nord Stream 2 sanctions that Trump imposed. When the invasion initially began, Biden actually offered to evacuate Zelensky, thus showing that there was no long-term plan to help Ukraine win back in February 2022. Even after the invasion, and while the US has generally stepped up, Biden is still very reluctant to provoke Russia, and therefore is reluctant to send further weapons and planes like F-16s until later in the war. And when the West sent weapons, they were only allowed to hit limited targets. And only after the Kharkiv offensive in 2024 did most of NATO allow Ukraine to strike deeper into Russia. And of course, it must be noted that a lot of NATO's militaries have been depleted and a lack of investment over the 30 years of peace. I mean, if the West was really provocative, defense spending be at least 5% of GDP, or even more so, like the 1950s where it was 10%, in nations like America, that even Eisenhower warned about a military-industrial complex. The US nuclear arsenal is also depleted. Its largest nuclear test was in 1992, and the US has generally shrugged its nuclear stockpile. I think all the aforementioned should destroy any illusions that the West is out to get Russia, or supposedly attempting to poke the Russian bear. Now, it's strange that the right is attacking a lot of the political establishment for being tough on Russia, when we could just see a lot of the populists in Europe, like France and Germany, and people like Vivek Ramaswamy in the United States, doing the exact thing as the establishment had done towards Russia and Ukraine. Like, it's literally doing the same thing over and over again while expecting a different result. And it's strange that those people claim that they're anti-establishment, when in reality they're doing the exact same thing and exactly the same policy as what Merkel and Macron and Biden has done. I just find it very strange, and I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of those politicians on the populist side are controlled opposition, either by the political establishment themselves, or even by the Russians, to help both sides of the political spectrum, which are both the political establishment and the supposed anti-establishment, to guide people into false dichotomies, rather than being able to search the truth that both sides of the political spectrum are working for Russia. More perplexing is that Russia's not even against globalism. Aside from the fact that Putin works for the WEF and has long associations with the WEF and Klaus Schwab, another piece of evidence is that the former Prime Minister of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, stated that his goals is an open Eurasia. Sounds very globalist to me. To summarize everything I've said in this video, and the last video as well, Putin is not based on trad. Putin is a globalist, and as expansionary goes, he's anti-Western and has been allied with anti-Western forces. And it would be very naive for the anti-establishment people to follow in the footsteps of the political establishment, the same people that led to the downfall of Western civilization, or at least is contributing to it. You dissident writers rightfully criticize the political establishment for capitulating on COVID-19 and being acquiescent to the lockdown madness, for opening borders to mass immigration and to endless free trade deals that hollowed out industrial centers, whether in the north of England or the Rust Belt in the United States. You rightfully criticize the political correctness madness, from the LGBTQ cult to wokeness in schools and whatnot. And therefore, it would be a shame for you to follow the political establishment's steps when it comes to Russia without even realizing it. Thanks for watching.